Thanks, Tamsin, and thanks, Xavier and the SGS, for the opportunity to speak to you all this morning. So the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters recently made headlines for proposing an increase to the size of federal parliament, both in the specific instance of doubling the number of territorial senators, and more broadly in increasing the size of the House of Representatives as a manner of reducing malapportionment and improving representation. But less attention has been paid to the fact that as it currently stands, Parliament is about to shrink slightly. Despite record high immigration and consequent population growth, the House of Representatives is set to be reduced from 151 seats to 150 by the time of the next election. Likewise, despite being home to more citizens than ever before, both New South Wales and Victoria are currently slated to have less representation in the nation's lower house. This seemingly strange situation is nothing new. In 1962, the Menzies government was faced with a report from the Independent Electoral Commissioners that would reduce the House of Reps by not one, but 2 seats at a time when an immigration boom was matched by a record high birth rate, which we are certainly not experiencing today. Both incidents are the product of Section 24 of the Australian Constitution, also known as the Nexus Clause, which states that the House of Representatives shall be composed of members directly chosen by the people of the Commonwealth, and the number of such members shall be, as merely as practicable, twice the number of the senators. The practicable caveat means that there can be rounding depending on the distribution of population between the states, hence the fluctuations in the House of Reps, even with a consistent Senate. Menzies changed the Representation Act in 1964 to try to ensure that any remainder above a quota was always rounded up to give a state an extra seat, but this was subsequently found unconstitutional in McKellar's case in 1977. Hence, any remainder not exceeding 50% of a quota is rounded down. Because governments have historically been very reluctant to increase the size of the Senate, or more specifically, the number of senators for each original state, the Nexus has consistently acted as a handbrake on plans to expand the Parliament. This is particularly the case in our modern age of proportional representation and the rise of minor parties, when any reduction in Senate quotas opens space for the eccentric, the principled, or even just the well-funded to squeeze through the two-party system. But even during the major party dominance of the 1960s, Menzies had his own concerns that you could only increase the Senate in a manner that ensured that there would be an uneven number of senators up for election from each state at each half-Senate election. This was so that you would have a clear winner as opposed to producing evenly balanced deadlocks. In fact, Menzies explicitly ruled out our current system of having 12 senators for each state and believed that each time you increase the number of senators for each original state, you would have to give 4 new senators to each state, meaning that the minimum increase was 24 senators and a whopping 48 MHRs. While our acceptance of more balanced election results has reduced the scale of this arithmetic, it hasn't gone away. Any increase in the House of Reps must be in lots of 12, or more realistically, 24, lest you create uneven half-Senate cycles. And it should be noted that recent proposals to increase the Senate representation of the territories are entirely separate from the Nexus, because territorial senators aren't actually included in the calculation of the size of the House, so these proposals don't even have that benefit to recommend them. Because the Nexus remains essential in shaping federal parliament, it is worth taking some time to unpack why it was introduced and why it has not gone away, vital questions that few have thus far been bothered to probe. That is, except for former SGS presenter Greg Malouche and myself, as we completed quite an extensive research project on the Nexus in 2018. As that project revealed, the clause is notable for appearing to be the only clause in the original Constitution which lacked any form of precedent. This in itself is a startling demonstration of the Burkean instincts of our founding fathers, instincts which have served the country well for over 123 years. The Constitution's framers explicitly did not want to be experimental, innovative, or engage in theoretical abstractions. They wanted proven solutions to the perennial problems raised in running a functioning democracy, problems they had encountered themselves in their colonial parliaments. Even an avowed progressive like Alfred Deakin would say that, quote, "The task that lies before this convention is not that of creating a new constitution. Any assemblage meeting with the design of shaping out of the inner consciousness of its members some novel form of government which might appear to be theoretically perfect would fail to do any useful or practical work." The question I'll raise in this paper is whether the nexus is the exception that proves the rule, i.e. a demonstration of the unforeseen consequences of constitutional innovation. This is certainly how Robert Menzies, who himself preferred a more organic, British-style, evolutionary constitution, viewed the nexus. He would respond to the 1962 redistribution proposals with what became the 1967 referendum, seeking to change Section 24. Menzies was hardly alone in holding this idealised British viewpoint either. It was a view shared by the founders who themselves had experience working under colonial parliamentary systems that lacked the rigidity of the future Commonwealth. However, a federal compact between pre-existing polities made a written constitution a necessity, and the blending of Westminster and Washington models likewise produced the bastard progeny that is the Nexus. The Nexus was an answer to two dilemmas. The first was a question of bicameralism. British responsible government, as it had evolved by the late 19th century, required that the government of the day maintain the support of the upper house, and therefore that in an extended constitutional deadlock, the upper house or House of Review should ultimately have to give way. And such constitutional deadlocks occurred in both New South Wales and Victoria in the 1890s. So this was an issue that was front of mind for the Constitution's framers. However, the principles of federalism, as espoused by key American thinkers like Alexander Hamilton, required that the People's House and the State's House be relatively equal partners in terms of governing. Such were the underlying tensions between the two concepts that the original Constitution of 1891, the one which Samuel Griffith is largely credited with having drafted. He actually wouldn't be involved in the second round of constitutional conventions because no Queenslander was. Queensland wasn't actually involved in 1897, 1898. That 1891 Constitution did not prescribe that the new Parliament would function under responsible government, or even that ministers would have to be members of Parliament. This is one of the main reasons why George Reid scuttled that 1891 proposal in New South Wales, earning himself the eternal enmity of the ardent supporters of federation in the process. While the smaller colonies would ultimately have to give way and accept responsible government, they would nevertheless do all they could to salvage the power and dignity of the Senate. First proposed by South Australian Richard Baker during the committee stages of the Adelaide Convention of 1897, the Nexus aimed to do this by ensuring that as the House of Reps expanded in line with increases in population, the Senate would keep pace, retaining its comparative size and apparently, therefore, respect. Even though its constitutional powers would be exactly the same, somehow, metaphysically, it was argued that the Senate would be weakened if it did not have at least half the numbers of its counterpart. That this had not happened in the United States, where the Senate was very powerful despite being much smaller than the House, was dismissed on account of the American Senate having powers of impeachment and approving appointments, which responsible government simply would not permit. Edmund Barton, who despite being a New South Welshman, repeatedly gave a voice to the concerns of the smaller colonies, and never more so than over this Nexus issue, went so far as to suggest that if the House expanded by itself, it would lead to the practical abolition of the power of the Senate. So despite genuinely trying to remain grounded and having this sort of Burkean understanding of things that are real tangible rather than thought out from abstract, in this instance, the delegates' arguments had become so intangible that they bear some comparison to those of recent voice proponents. The second dilemma the Nexus aimed to solve was making sure that the expansion of the House was not too rapid or automatic, as it would be if the Constitution directly prescribed a quota for the size of each electorate, which it had done in the 1891 draft. It was one of those until the Parliament otherwise provides provisions, but the argument was that you couldn't trust a Parliament to retrench itself. The members would want to keep the quota low so they would keep having plenty of seats and always have jobs. This fear of ballooning representation was based in large part on figures provided to the conventions by New South Wales government statistician Timothy Coughlin, who at the time was a really respected figure in his field, and he predicted that Australia would have a population of 22 million people by 1941, and if the original formula were maintained, potentially a House of 446 MPs. The cost involved in having this many members was seen as a major detriment at a time when the payment of members was a relatively novel concept. So much so that for years after it was introduced, George Reid would actually return his parliamentary salary to the Treasury because he was so opposed to the idea. More importantly, the prospective cost of federation was one of the central arguments used to oppose it. So the ardent federalists who composed the convention were keen to rob their opponents of any additional ammunition. The grandiose dreams of Australian expansion, to which Coughlin's figures sort of indicated, also suggested the emergence of new states, particularly out of New South Wales and Queensland. Victoria actually, on these figures, was meant to become a small state, so it sort of voted weird in a lot of the votes in the conventions because of that. It didn't think of itself as being a big state forever and ever and ever. It was assumed that the additional Senate representation these new states would require would ease the pressures of the Nexus, although it must be noted that any new state would not be automatically entitled to representation equal to that of an original state. Equal representation, regardless of population, was not thought of as a necessity of federalism, as it had been in the United States, but instead a conscious distortion of the democratic principle, one vote, one value, that was deliberately made a one-time offer. Restricting the growth of the House would also protect the representation of the original small states in another way, as they were guaranteed the additional sweetener of a minimum 5 members in that chamber. Needless to say, this minimum would be proportionately more powerful the smaller the House was. And to this day, Tasmania still relies on its minimum to maintain its 5 seats. One might assume that the Nexus was linked to Section 57, which outlines that a joint sitting of the two houses can resolve a deadlock between them that has survived a double dissolution. This necessitates having a set ratio of representation between the two houses, lest the Senate be overwhelmed in an actual voting arrangement, rather than in the more theoretical fashion suggested by Barton. However, the Nexus Clause was added to the Constitution before the joint sitting provision. Hence, the joint sitting served only to more permanently entrench the Nexus. It meant that the delegates sort of stopped debating about it, rather than to inspire it. By the time of the 1967 referendum, the joint sitting would scarcely be raised in the debate, because at that point it had never been used. So in summary, of the two aims of the Nexus, one was too abstract to be of much substance, and the other it has overachieved, largely because no new states have emerged. Apart from the introduction of territorial representation, there have only been 2 increases in the size of the Senate, and therefore sort of permanent increases in the size of the Parliament as a whole since Federation, and they were introduced by the Labor governments of Ben Chifley and Bob Hawke, respectively. However, while no Liberal government has ever introduced an increase, the party's founder, Robert Menzies, was a consistent advocate for increases. When he first suggested the idea as Prime Minister in 1941, he had to point out that this was even constitutionally possible because it had never been done before and people had sort of forgotten that it could be done. Then in 1943, he dedicated one of his Forgotten People radio broadcasts to advocating for a bigger parliament. His arguments in favour were multifaceted. More members would offer a wider array of talent from which to pick cabinet. After all, he said, a much better cricket team can be chosen from Australia than from Randwick. Greater numbers would decrease the likelihood of a handful of independents holding a disproportionate balance of power position, as they did after the 1940 election and in our own lifetimes, the 2010 election. Smaller electorates would not only represent more real and tangible communities, but they would offer members a smaller workload so they would have more time to devote to big picture issues. And if people were still concerned about having too many politicians, Menzies suggested culling some more state MPs. Large-scale reductions in the size of state parliaments had already occurred in New South Wales and Victoria shortly after Federation. This was brought about by Gladstonian-inspired retrenchment and reform campaigns, which sought to offset the massive burdens created by a new tier of governance, burdens which were more keenly felt in the larger states because they paid the majority of taxes. This retrenchment and reform campaign was known in Victoria as the Kyabram movement, which some classical liberals of the late 20th century rediscovered and have celebrated for its impulse to reduce the size of government. It seems to me that Australian liberalism is faced with a significant philosophical dilemma when it comes to this issue. On the one hand, Liberals naturally want smaller government, which a smaller parliament achieves in a very literal but perhaps ineffective manner. On the other hand, Liberals are dedicated to decentralisation and subsidiarity, the idea that political decisions should be made at the most local level which is practicable, ideally by the individual, but also by the local community, to which smaller electorates arguably give more direct representation. Indeed, they admitted as much in the debates in the constitutional conventions, but the defenders of the Nexus argued that it didn't really matter about representing communities in the House of Reps because the Commonwealth only had a handful of powers and they were only on national issues. So there just wouldn't be the scope for the Commonwealth to vote on things that are going to affect people at the local level. These contradictions of philosophy would come out in the 1967 referendum, in which a ragtag group comprised of the DLP and a handful of coalition backbenchers, all of whom were senators, successfully scuttled a proposal that otherwise had such overwhelming bipartisan support that it passed the House of Reps unanimously. It was actually the first time a bill had passed the House of Reps unanimously since 1915, at the start of the First World War. Although the No campaigners were also helped by the fact that Prime Minister Harold Holt simply did not care about the issue as much as the now retired Menzies had. The Yes campaign succeeded only in the largest state of New South Wales, although it should be noted that the second highest Yes vote was actually here in Queensland, while No's landslide margin of 59.75% was close to that of last October. The great cry of the No campaign in 1967 was "No more politicians." It's a cry that resonated at the time of the constitutional conventions and likely would resonate today. Indeed, just yesterday afternoon we were told by a current politician that one of the reasons why it's not realistic to bring back the Legislative Council in Queensland is because that cry of no more politicians would just be too electorally powerful. Earlier this year, former minister turned Spectator columnist Neil Brown wrote that a bigger parliament means more snouts in the trough, advisors, editorless committees, labyrinthine red tape, higher salaries, dodgy allowances, cars, and flights on Air Albo. I suspect many in the audience would agree with him. But it's not like a proposal to increase the number of MPs were it introduced by someone with a clear Menzian persuasion, could not be tied to offsetting cost-cutting of members' staffs and allowances, or even take a page out of George Reed's book and just abolish the payment of members. After all, Sir Robert's father, James Menzies, was a leading figure in the Kyabram movement. The ills of Australian parliamentary democracy are multifaceted. They certainly don't stem from having too many MPs, considering we have a comparatively small parliament and electorate sizes have ballooned at the same time that the quality of our political process has noticeably decreased. Indeed, the smallness of party rooms is often blamed for the ferocious way in which our MPs are whipped into line to a far greater extent than either the UK's House of Commons or America's House of Reps. Another argument made by Isaac Isaacs at the conventions, but now somewhat forgotten, is that bigger electorates take more campaigning time, resources, and ultimately money to win. Would Climate 200 have been able to influence the outcome of our elections quite so drastically if they had to deal with real communities rather than vast amalgamations of voters? Would individuals and community groups, conversely, have a greater opportunity to make an impact if the task before them was more manageable? At the time of the conventions, Australia's party system was just emerging, and Labor didn't win any delegate representation at all. But at a time when that system now faces a great crisis, it's worth asking, would the membership of our political parties have hollowed out quite so badly if members were given more direct control, not through roundabout means like pre-selection reform or plebiscites, but through having smaller electorates in which the candidate was inherently more directly tied to a community branch? Although proposals to abolish the Nexus were resurrected by the Whitlam government in the 1970s, by the Hawke government in the 1980s, and have never really gone away. There's just always this impetus, particularly on the Labor side of politics, to abolish the Nexus. Debate over the clause is largely theoretical these days, ironically like it was at the conventions. The clause survived a bipartisan referendum, so must be considered one of the safest clauses in the entire Constitution, particularly in a climate in which all clauses seem pretty safe for the moment. If a Prime Minister wants to increase the Parliament, they're going to have to increase the Senate and deal with a larger crossbench. Whether that's detrimental is very much open to interpretation. It certainly isn't inherently. Whatever negative effects it does have would arguably be lessened if we resurrected Menzies' ideas and insisted on having an uneven number of senators for each state facing the polls at each cycle. That way, again, we would have clearer winners, even if those winners were no longer one of the major parties, but an overall swing to the right or to the left. What the Nexus Clause reveals most clearly is that once you introduce a constitutional innovation, it is impossible to predict what its consequences will be. Our founding fathers did not want a house that expanded too rapidly, but neither did they want a house that barely expands at all. They assumed that the creation of new states would not only mitigate the Nexus, but drive decentralisation across a vast and varied continent. Instead, each new redistribution leaves rural areas with fewer and fewer seats and geographically huger and huger seats that are completely untangible. They have no ties to community whatsoever. As the federal parliament increasingly reflects little more than a federation of large and impersonal cities. Meanwhile, the voices in that parliament are homogenised not just by the party system, the flaws in our media climate and all the other problems we so easily identify, but by the composite nature of the electorates themselves. Thanks.